Hello, welcome back to the Arturia Jupiter-8 video series. We've dealt with the controls of the main synthesizer, but if we drop down this little double arrow button over here, we get access to a load more functionality, and today we're talking about this tab here called the Galaxy module. Now the Galaxy module is a bit of a law unto itself. I've never really seen anything quite like it. It's a means by which various LFOs are plotted on a graph, and then you can modulate each of those LFOs relative to each other in real time. It's too crazy to explain. I need to demonstrate it. This is the interface, and you can see that we've got this X. We have two lines, one labelled LFO1, and there's a plus and a minus, and then here's LFO2 with another plus and a minus. Those pluses and minuses can lead to confusion, so just bear in mind that positive and negative in the context of this thing is a very flexible concept. We'll get to that shortly. Each one of these LFOs, the line represents a journey through time, and that journey is plotted with a wave. So on a LFO1 at the moment, we've got the shape set to sine, which means it's going to draw a sine wave. LFO1 is going to operate as a sine wave. If I turn LFO1 on, however, what you're going to see is a straight line. We've got this little comet travelling across the graph, followed by a vapour trail, and it's drawing a straight line. But what you're actually seeing there is an overhead view of a sine wave. If you look at a sine wave side on, the classical view, then you see the thing travel through time and you see it go up and down across on its journey. But if you rotate that sine wave so that you're looking at it from above, you would see a single point travelling left and right, and you would see this. That's exactly what's happening. Can you see as it reaches the end of each of the extremities, it slows down and then it picks up again? That's the direction, that's the motion of a sine wave. A triangle, on the other hand, which is all very angular and straight lined, is actually a constant velocity journey through time. Triangles never change speed. And so if I change this LFO1 to triangle, you'll see now it's a little bit difficult to see, but when it gets to the end, it bounces straight off that end point and carries on its journey just like a triangle wave does. Now that's LFO1. Why? Well, there's a few questions. Why is it drawing a straight line? We've kind of dealt with that. It's the top-down view of the sine wave. Why is it up here in this kind of strange no man's land? Now, we will deal shortly with why this line is being drawn so far away from the LFO1 line itself. Don't worry about this parallel distance here. As I say, we'll get to it shortly. I want to demonstrate the thing actually doing some work. So we've got an LFO1, it's a sine wave, it's operating at a frequency, 0.15 Hz. Let's make it do something. I'm going to map the x-axis to pitch. So now when I press a key on the keyboard, the pitch is going to change. I've just set this knob down to 0, so at the moment we don't get any change. As I increase the modulation, follow where this point is and also have a look at the background. You see these dotted lines? You've got this dotted line saying Y output and another dotted line over here saying X output. That X output is coming from this grey line in the background. Every time this point is to the right of the centre point, the pitch is going to go up, and vice versa. There's the pitch low, and there it becomes positive, and it stays positive until there when it becomes negative again. So the modulation amount, whether or not it's an additive or a reductive value, is dependent on the background of this chart, not the red line itself. We've got two separate positive and negative axes here, and we need to be really careful about figuring out which one is which. So here, when we hear the pitch, we're dealing with the background graph. So this section here is X positive. Similarly, this section here is Y positive. And so only in this upper right quadrant are both X and Y positive at the same time. That's just, standard maths-based graph stuff. But then overlaid on top of that, we've got the LFO1's journey, which also has a positive and negative territory, and that's described by this line. But that entire graph can be rotated, and if I do that, it'll make a little bit more sense to you. So this axe rotation down here allows me to rotate the entire chart. And now you can see that LFO1 is going upside down. So I'm going to try and stop it at its exact halfway point, which is there. Now then, that vapor trail is still carrying on in the same direction. It's still going backwards and forwards, parallel to and equidistant from the LFO1 line. Now when I press the key, listen to what the note does. The note is still positive on this half of the chart, or higher pitched than the root note, and it's lower pitched than the root note on this side of the chart. But the LFO1 line is now inverted. So this is saying LFO1 positive, this is saying LFO1 negative. That's merely the direction of travel. It's got nothing to do with whether or not the output modulation is positive or negative. That is determined by the background. Just carry on the demonstration and turn this thing on. Did you see then, when it got to the absolute extremity, where the axe had rotated to the point where it was completely perfect on the background graph, it actually changed direction, and now it's travelling anti-clockwise. Now if we follow this graph round, it's going to complete one total revolution. So that's halfway, that's 3/4 of the way. Watch what happens when it completes its revolution, slows down, slows down, slows down, and then sets off positive clockwise again. The rotation is itself a sine wave. So the direction in which this thing is moving in the direction of a sine wave. If I change this graph to a triangle, then it's going to still complete one complete revolution in each direction, but can you see when it reaches at the end of each of those revolutions, it bounces hard and starts in the opposite direction instantly. To follow it, there it goes. So that's a triangle wave. It's drawing a straight line, a straight line, a straight line, and then immediately starts going in the opposite direction. So what effect does the rotating graph have on our modulation? Well, I've left everything else completely static. Remember that pitch rise that we heard earlier? It sounded like a police siren going up and then going down smoothly, as you would expect a modulation effect to do. Now we're actually rotating that modulation around a center point axis. So let's hear what effect that has on the pitch. Try to follow, ignore the vapor trail if you can, and try to follow the point that the comet is describing. The pitch is still mapping exactly to whether or not it's on the right hand side of the chart or the left hand side of the chart. It's just that modulation is now far more complex than the simple sine wave that we had originally, because the universe in which that sine wave is moving is in constant motion. The background is actually rotating in opposite directions as the wave is drawn. Let's turn the rotation off. In fact, we'll turn everything off. So that's LFO1 dealt with, and you can see that when I turned it off, it just so happened that LFO1 was pointing directly north-south. So just as a matter of interest, what happens if I get this going and now press a key? Very, very little indeed. There's an absolutely microscopic modulation being applied in the X direction to LFO1. If I increase that angle very, very slightly and then turn it off again, now you'll hear a slightly more kind of detune effect. You can just about hear that. So there's an example of LFO1 not being an X-axis operator, is now a Y-axis operator. The two things are separate. LFO2, on the other hand, is now this line here. So that is operating currently on the X-axis. So if I turn LFO2 on, we're going to go back to having a dramatic effect on VCO1 pitch. So just think about that for a moment. The LFO, whether it's LFO1 or LFO2, is irrelevant. The only important concept is whether it's an X output or a Y output and what modulation effect we're trying to have. Whether or not it's LFO1 or 2 applying that effect is completely dependent upon the shape that's currently being drawn by this module. So we've not mapped LFO2 to VCO1 pitch. We've mapped the X-axis to the pitch, to VCO1 pitch. I did warn you it was a bit brain bending. I hope you're following me so far. Now, did you see when I turned the LFO off, it left a little red dot behind? That's the intersection point of the two LFOs. So if I now turn LFO1 back on, it's going to draw a line in this direction, parallel to and equidistant from its native line. There you see that. Turn that off at any time and turn LFO2 back on and it starts drawing a line in that direction. Now what happens when I turn both LFOs on at the same time? Now we start to draw some really pretty complex shapes. If you're a quantum physicist, you might recognize some of the stuff because it starts looking like collision trails. But basically these two LFOs are now operating still completely independently. These LFOs have no idea that the other one exists. It just so happens that the environment in which they're operating does link them together. And so we only ever have a single focal point at any given time. This is where both LFO1 and LFO2 are at this moment in time, either positive or negative. And if we change the speeds of them, you can see now the slower LFO2 is like walking gently along its axis, and the faster LFO1 is running up and down merrily on its axis. This is the joining point of those two LFOs. If I leave both of those LFOs running and turn axe rotation on as well, all hell breaks loose. Because now, in addition to those two LFOs saying, I'm going quickly, I'm going slowly, this is our joining point, now the entire graph upon which those operations are being performed is rotating in the background. But you can still see fundamentally that the LFO2 is operating quite slowly as it travels on its line, and LFO1 is operating much more quickly as it draws its line. It's just that they're all swirling now as the background alters as well. If I turn one of these LFOs off, now this comet point is going to remain absolutely equidistant from the LFO1 line. It doesn't matter what it does, it doesn't matter how fancy the vapor trails are in the background. That's irrelevant. That's a past history. This is what's gone before. The fact is that the head of the comet is always equidistant from the LFO1 line. What this gives us is the ability to have some exceptionally complex modulation options. We can alter pitch, we can alter pulse width, cutoff of both high pass and low pass filters, resonance, amplitude, volume. So if I map two different parameters to X and Y outputs, whap some of that up, and now play a note. In addition to you hearing pitch modulation that's being applied on the X-axis, we've got filter cutoff being applied on the Y-axis simultaneously. And as you can see, you've got three outputs for each the X and Y axes. So the modulation options available to you between these different LFOs is just absolutely mind-blowing. Obviously, if we introduce more complex shapes into the equation, you start getting really kind of angular hits as the sawtooth falls off its cliff, or the triangle kind of bounces into the opposite direction. And now instead of drawing this like constantly smooth swirling graph, every now and again you're going to see like a hard angular change. There we go, look at that one, that was a nice one. That was the sawtooth just firing, getting to the end of its ramp and then falling off and jumping to a new place on the graph. What does that sound like? So there you can hear sometimes pitch is the dominant effect, sometimes filters the dominant effect. Oh, that was a nice one. And sometimes it's both. Let's turn everything back off again. And wherever we turn it off, the vapor trail disappears. That's the comet head. That's the current intersection point of the two LFOs. Angle merely allows us to manually rotate the background graph. So by default it's set to 180 degrees, which is the midpoint. If I set it anywhere else, it's just literally just applying a manual offset to anything else. From that point onwards, when we start rotating, it picks up from that point and says, right, I'll carry on from there. Sync merely changes these controls from hertz into tempo. And could you see each time I turn this control on or off, it's currently set to hertz until I click it and then change it and it switches to a tempo based thing. Tempo divided by 8 is the slowest rate we've got, which is still pretty nippy. So you get much finer control in frequency mode. But basically what retrigger does is each time I press a key, it bounces back to reset all of the LFOs to 0. So it's always resetting the background graph to 0 and all of the internal LFOs to 0 as well. I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it useful, and if you did, please consider subscribing, hit notifications, and you find out when the next episode comes out. Hope to see you then. Thanks a lot.